This will be the result of this tutorial. I'm going to show you how to draw back a bowstring and shoot some arrows in the game engine. The arrows also have a bit of trajectory to them. You'll see they'll start to dip down the longer they're in the air. And the further you pull the bowstring back, the further the arrow will go. If you just tap it, it's going to land right in front of you. And I'm also going to show you how to make these arrows attach to anything they come in contact with, whether it's the ground or a tree or one of the targets. The next tutorial in this series will go over attaching this bow to a first-person shooter type character, so you can control the bow's aim and shooting the arrows with mouse controls instead of keyboard controls. But for this tutorial, we're just going to set up some simple keyboard controls for it. Open up the start file for this tutorial and take a look at the arrow. Make a quick note that the origin for this arrow is at the very end of it, flush against the bowstring. That'll be important for when we use the add-object-actuator later and actually add a dynamic arrow shooting from the bow. Also, before we move on, make sure that Blender Game is enabled in the options in the top header. Now let me quickly describe to you what we're going to do through this tutorial and how this is going to work. We're going to start by parenting this bow to the bowstring so that it's drawn back with the bowstring. And when we're in the game, when we first start the game, this arrow is going to be invisible. And when you press spacebar, it's going to become visible so that you can actually see the arrow being drawn back with the bow. So it's going to be drawn back, and when it's released, when the bowstring is released, this arrow will become invisible, and a second arrow will be added using the add-object-actuator, and this will be a dynamic object that actually interacts with the environment, sticking to things like targets and trees, and actually having a bit of trajectory to it as well. And that's basically the gist of what's going to happen. And the longer you hold spacebar, the further the bowstring is drawn back, and that means the further the arrow will shoot. The first thing we're going to do is duplicate the arrow. So with the arrow selected, press Shift and D to duplicate. Keep it in the same position. And we're going to rename this in the object buttons. We're going to rename it to arrow. And we need to move this by pressing the M key to the very last layer, or any hidden layer will do. Because we're going to be using that for the add object actuator, it has to be moved to a hidden layer. That's the only way that will work. So we can ignore that arrow for now and select the original arrow. Now we're going to parent this to the bow armature. To do that, we're going to select all of the vertices in edit mode. And in the object data buttons, we're going to add a vertex group called string. And we're going to click on assign. String is the name of the bone that draws back the bowstring. So we added the arrow to the vertex group string so that it's deformed by the string bone. So in object mode, with the arrow selected, hold Shift and select the bow's armature. Press Ctrl and P and select Armature Deform. Now if you press Alt and A, you should see the bowstring draw back the arrow with it. Perfect. Now the problem with this is that the arrow is actually intersecting the bow's handle. So we have to edit the animation of the bowstring so that it kind of compensates for that and moves the arrow next to the handle. So in the right window, open the dope sheet so we can look at the action editor. And now, where the first keyframes are, in pose mode, select the string bone, and in top view, rotate it a little so that it rotates the arrow away from the handle, but flush against it. Just like that. And press the I key and select rotation. Now go up to the next keyframe by pressing the up key. And we're going to rotate it on the Z-axis the same way so that it's nice and flush against the handle. And we're going to insert another rotation keyframe. And go up to the next keyframe and do the same thing. And insert rotation. And now let's go back to the first frame and see how everything looks being pulled back. It looks perfect. And you don't need to worry about the release, because the second the string is released, this arrow becomes invisible, so you're not going to see this intersection. You just need to make sure that the arrow is next to the handle up until the frame is released. Now get out of pose mode and select that arrow. I'm going to go back to frame 1. And in the Properties window, select Physics Properties and enable Invisible and change the physics type to No Collision. That doesn't need collision, and we want that to start off invisible. And while we're at it, select the bow mesh. We're going to also click on No Collision for that in the Physics Properties, because that also doesn't need any collision. Now with the mouse hovered over the 3D view, press the P key just to make sure that the arrow is invisible when we start the game. And it is. And now upon pressing spacebar, we're going to make sure that this arrow becomes visible. So select the arrow, and in the logic editor, add a keyboard sensor. Click in the key area and press the spacebar. And we're going to change the name of that sensor to spacebar. Add the controller and let's connect these two. And add the actuator visibility. And make sure that visible is enabled. And connect the controller to that actuator. And let's see if this works. Press P over the 3D view, press spacebar, and then boom, the arrow shows up. Alright, so I'm going to minimize them, and now we're going to start working with a little bit of Python. Basically, our Python script is going to do this. When you're holding spacebar in, we're going to play the bow's animation frame 1 through 40, which is the drawing back of the string. Else, when you release spacebar, we're going to play frames 41 through 46, which is the string's release animation. This is also going to shoot the bow into our scene, and it's going to make our original bow here being drawn back invisible again. So let's start by selecting the armature object. We're going to add some logic bricks, and I'm going to change the right window here to the text editor. That's where we're going to create our Python script. So in the logic editor, with the armature selected, add the sensor keyboard, and in the key field, press spacebar, and let's rename this sensor to space. It's important that you rename these sensors because we're going to need to call them directly in our Python script. So add this to the controller Python, connect them. Since we don't have a script written yet, we can't really put anything in that field. And now add the actuator action. Connect those two somehow, and rename that action to pull. We're going to select the bow's action, which is called armature action. We're going to change the play type to flipper, so that when you release spacebar, it's going to reverse the animation and play back to the first frame. We're going to deselect continue, and we're going to change the start frame to 1 and the end frame to 40, since that's the pull animation range. We're going to add another actuator called message, and in the subject field we're going to type in fire, and we're going to connect that to the Python controller as well. So rename that actuator to fire and minimize that. Now to actually create our Python script, in the text editor on the right, click on the new button in the header, and let's rename our script to, I don't know, what should we name this? I'm no good with names. Let's go with big butts with a Z on the end so it's cooler. And in the Python controller, click on the empty field and you'll have your list of available Python scripts. So select big butts, minimize that, and now we can start writing our Python script. At the top of our script, we need some essential information. Let's start by typing import bge. And beneath that, let's get access to the controller that's running the Python script. Do that by typing cont equals bge.logic.getCurrentController. controller, and then 2 parentheses at the end there. That gets the controller that's running the Python script. And from there we can get the owner of the controller, which is the object, the armature object in this case. And from there we can access sensors and actuators and object properties and anything we need to. So the third line will be own equals cont.owner. That gets the owner of the controller, the armature object in this case. And now we're going to get access to some of the actuators. Let's access the pull actuator by typing pull equals cont.actuators, left bracket, parentheses, pull, and close the brackets. So that gets the list of actuators, and from there we call the pull actuator. Beneath that, let's get access to the fire actuator. So fire equals cont.actuators, bracket, quotes, fire, end bracket. And now let's get the spacebar sensor. So space equals cont.sensors, space, and the bracket. And now the real scripting begins. Let's start off with an if statement. If space dot positive, which is basically saying if you're holding spacebar, pull dot frame start equals 1, pull dot frame end equals 40, cont dot activate pull. So let me explain this real quick. If you're holding spacebar, it takes the pull actuator, which is the actuator that plays the action. It sets its starting frame to 1 and its end frame to 40. So if you're holding the spacebar, it's playing the drawing of the bow animation, the drawing of the bowstring. And we activate that actuator with this line here, cont.actuate, activate, parentheses, pull, end parentheses. So we have that situated. So let's go down 2 lines and back to the start of the line and type in else pull dot frame start equals 41, pull dot frame end equals 46. So this right here is saying if you're holding spacebar in, play the drawing of the string animation. Else, if you release spacebar, we're going to change the frame start to 41 and frame end to 46 so that it's playing the string release animation. We're going to activate the pull actuator with this line, cont.actuate, activate, parentheses, pull, end parentheses. We're also going to type in cont.activate, parentheses, fire, end parentheses. So when you release the spacebar, it's going to play the string being released animation, and it's also going to send out the fire message. And that's basically the whole of our script. We're just going to add a couple of lines later, but we can work with this for now. Now select the original arrow here, and add the sensor, message, and in the subject field type in fire. Connect that to an AND controller, and connect that to a I bit my freaking lip. All my practice talking and I bite my lip somehow. Connect that to a visibility controller. Ow. And deselect visible so that it's basically invisibility. So whenever this arrow receives the message fire, which is when the bowstring is released, it becomes invisible. Let's just make sure everything works. Press the P key over the 3D view. Arrow starts off invisible, good. When you hold the space bar, the arrow becomes visible, and when you release it, boom, perfect. Perfect. Now we're going to create an empty that's going to be our arrow launcher. So when it receives the message fire, it's actually going to add that dynamic arrow that we created earlier. So in top view, press Shift and C to center the 3D cursor at the world origin 0, 0, 0. Press Shift and A and add an empty. And in front view, we're going to position this thing at the furthest extent of the bowstring being released. So go ahead in the animation a few frames until the string is released. Find the furthest point it's released at, where the string kind of inverts, and place this empty right at the tip of it, because that's where our arrow is going to be added. I'm going to go back to frame 1, and I'm going to select the empty, hold Shift, and select the armature, and I'm going to parent that to the armature object. So select Set Parent to Object. Now select the empty, and the object buttons, we're going to rename this to arrow underscore launcher. Now we're going to add some logic bricks for it. So with the empty selected, add a message sensor with subject fire. Connect that to an AND controller, and connect that to an edit object actuator. Change the edit object type to add object, if that's not already default. And in the object field, click on that and select arrow. And we're going to have it live for a time of 750. Leave these other settings as they are, except for linear velocity, we're going to enable that little L key, which stands for local, which means the arrow will be added based on the empty's axis instead of the world axis. So this setup tells the empty object to add the arrow when it receives the message fire. Now what do? Now we're going to edit the Python script, add a couple extra lines to make the arrow shoot from the empty based on how far back the bowstring is pulled. Before we add the final touches to the Python script, let's real quick go to the hidden layer and select that arrow. Go to the physics options, change the physics type to dynamic so that it can interact with the scene. Enable ghost so that it goes through things that we don't want it to stick to. Enable collision bounds and change the bounds to triangle mesh. That way collisions actually take into account the entire shape of the object and not just a sphere or a box collision bound. So we can go back to the first layer now, and we can finish up our script. Now we're going to use Python to change the values of that add object actuator that our empty has. To do that, we're going to need to call that actuator, so let's give it a new name. So select the empty and change the name of the edit object actuator to add underscore arrow. Now in the Python script, in the top area, type in this line: launcher equals bge.logic.getSceneList, left and right parentheses, left bracket 0, right bracket, dot objects, left bracket, quotation, arrow underscore launcher, quotation, and right bracket. Bear with me, that's a long line, but let me explain what it does. bge.logic.getSceneList parentheses. That line gets a list of all the scenes in your blend file. Since we only have one scene, we know what scene that we want to call from that list, which is the first one. So to call the first item in that list, you type in left bracket 0, right bracket. Now from that scene, we want to get a list of objects. That's why we type in dot objects. And then in brackets and quotations, we type in the name of the object we want, which is arrow underscore launcher. So now we have access to our empty object. We just need one more line now. Under else, meaning when the spacebar is released, type in this line: launcher.actuators, left bracket, quotations, add underscore arrow, quotation, right bracket, dot linear velocity equals, and before we finish that line, let me explain the first half of it. This line gets the linear velocity field from the add arrow actuator from our launcher object so that we can edit the x, y, and z values. Now to edit the x, y, and z values, type in left bracket, negative, parentheses, pull, dot frame, times 15, right parentheses, comma, 0, comma, 0, right bracket. Now multiplication in Python is indicated with an asterisk instead of an X. So let me explain what these values are. We have our X value, our Y value, and Z value. Both the Y and Z values are 0. We want to change the X value of the linear velocity because we created the empty in top view, which means the empty's axis runs horizontally from left to right. And we want a negative value because that's the way our bow is pointing, to the left, which would be a negative X value. So basically pull.frame takes the current frame of the bow being drawn back and multiplies that by 15 just for an extra power boost. So for example, if you pull back the string 10 frames, it would be 10 times 15, which would be 150, so our X value would be negative 150. Now you can change the value 15 to something higher or lower to make your arrows go faster or slower. That's just a multiplier there. That's nothing that I've drawn from anything except for trial and error trying to get the arrow to go the speed that I wanted it to. So our X value is the current frame times 15 at a negative with a negative in front of that. Our Y value is 0 and our Z value is 0. And that should be everything we need for these arrows to shoot correctly now. So press P over the 3D view, pull back the bow, and let it go, and then boom, arrow shoots perfectly. Now just tap the spacebar, and you'll see it going very slowly. Very, very slowly. We still need to add some artificial gravity to make the arrow drop a lot faster. But our Python script is working perfectly. So let's do that. Let's go to that hidden layer and select our dynamic arrow. And let's add an always sensor connected to an AND controller and connect that to a motion actuator. And our motion actuator is going to create the artificial gravity that makes our arrow drop a little bit faster. And it's also going to create a bit of a trajectory, which we're kind of going to fake here. It's kind of a cheap way to do it, but it works. So under force, in the Z value, type in negative 200 and deselect local so that it's global. So this arrow is always going to be pulled down at a force of negative 200 on the global Z axis. Press P and let's see how fast it drops. And that's much better. Now for a little trajectory. Go down to the angular field. Change the Y value to negative 0.4 and enable local on that one so that it rotates on its own axis and not the global axis. So zoom out, press P, and let's watch it drop and rotate. Perfect. I'll go back to the first layer and let's shoot a couple arrows and see how they do. Wonderful. Now we want the arrows to stick into anything that they hit. To do that, we're going to suspend the dynamics when they come in contact with something with a certain property. So with the dynamic arrow selected, add another sensor for collision. And under property, type in stick. Connect that to an AND controller and connect that to an edit object actuator and change the type to dynamics. And under dynamic, select suspend dynamics. So it'll stop moving whenever it comes into contact with something with the stick property. So go to the first layer and the layer beneath that, which is the little environment I made. And we're basically going to give everything in the scene the stick property because we want it to stick to anything that it comes in contact with in this scene. So select the ground, add a game property of type Boolean, or however you pronounce that, Boolean. Anyway, change the property name to stick and enable that little checkbox, which makes it true. I'm going to select all the trees, and I'm going to press Ctrl and J to join them together to make this easy. Add the same game property for that, stick, boolean, enable the checkbox for true. I'm going to select all the targets, and I'm going to join them together. I'm going to do the same thing. Add the stick game property, type boolean, enable the checkbox. So go into camera view, and let's see if these arrows stick. And they do, yay. Now we're going to add a couple just simple controls to move the bow around so that we can shoot everything in the scene just to play around. We're going to have the armature rotate up and down, and then we're going to parent that to an empty that rotates left and right. So select the armature, add a keyboard sensor for up, rename that up, and add a keyboard sensor for down, and rename that down. Attach both of these to their own end controllers, and add a motion actuator with -1 for the Z value of rotation, and connect the up arrow sensor to that one, and another motion actuator with 1 as the value for Z in rotation, and connect the down arrow to that one. So back in camera view, let's see if that works. Up key, down key, shoot, shoot, shoot. Great. Now in top view, with the cursor still centered, add 0, 0, 0 by pressing Shift and C. Press Shift and A to add another empty. Now it's kind of tiny. It's lost in the middle of all that wireframe. So let's change the size of that in the object data options to 10. Alright, 15. Now select the armature, hold Shift, and select the empty. Press Ctrl and P to parent the armature to the empty. Now we'll add the left and right controls to the empty. Add a keyboard sensor for left, rename it left. Add a keyboard sensor for right, rename it right. Attach them both to their own end controllers. And let's add some more motion actuators. Let's change the Z value for the rotation field to 1 and connect the left arrow to that one. Let's just see if that works real quick. And yep, that's what we wanted. And add one more motion actuator. Connect the right key to it and make that -1 Z value in the rotation field. Now full screen it. Press P, rotate the bow and arrow around. Wonderful. Now we can get that smug target up in the tree thinking it's all safe. I'm terrible at this game. Bullseye!